to south, we have the Greenland Eskimos. They have Central Eskimos, Copper Eskimos, and Mackenzie Eskimos, I guess. They have Alaskan, up by the Yukon River, Eskimos. Then down here we have Talton, Caribou Eskimos. And we have all kind of along the southern Canada, northern American border. We have the northern forests. And we have the, what is that? Toket. Northwest coast, we have the Shimian, the Haida Bella. I'm probably not getting these right. The Quackatul, Doodle, the Nukta, and Shoshone down here in the west Rocky Mountains, the Paiute, the Ute, the Washoe, the Mono. Oh, there's a lot more than I think I would like to read at the risk of losing your interest, because I'm never one to read names and places if I don't have a context or a story in which I can fit them in. Pawnee, there we go, Pawnee. Everybody knows Parks and Recreation. That's trivializing them, to say the least. Down here we have the Apache, Navajo, Hopi. Those are very famous Indian tribes. Just kind of hugged on the south side of the Colorado River. And then right around the Missouri, in between the Missouri and Arkansas rivers, we have the Sioux, the Pawnee, the Cheyenne, and Apapo. Or Arapaho, maybe that's what it's called. And then the Red River. In between the Red River and the Rio Grande, we have the Comanches, which I actually just watched a John Wayne movie about. It was called Red River, and it was about having to transfer cattle, thousands of heads of cattle, and avoid Comanches, and not to mention possible stampedes if you screwed up. It was a really good movie. And then we have the Choctaw down near Louisiana. Down by me we have the Seminole Indians. I love that song. Roll, roll, Seminole winds, blow like you're never gonna blow again. It's a really good song. And we have the Creek, Chickasaw, the Cherokee, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and the Eastern Woodlands. This is kind of interesting looking at the map of North America like this. Kind of reminds me of looking at a Lord of the Rings map of Middle Earth, where you have these no political boundaries. I kind of like that. And it just kind of labels everything based on geography and terrain and ecology. Northern forests, the far west, the eastern woodlands, the Gulf of Mexico, the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, all these epic, grandiose sounding names. I like that. I really like that. And then as we move north up the eastern coast, we have the Iroquois. guess there was a tribe actually called the Delaware. I didn't realize that. And the Huron and the Mi'kmaq. Again, I can't really read that. Oh, and the Cree. I forgot, I've heard of them before. Labrador Eskimos and Niceguy. And there's Newfoundland way out there. So, archaeologists believe that the first inhabitants of America were bands of hunters who crossed the Bering Strait from Siberia about 25,000 years ago. And this book was written in 1981, I think, so it might be a little bit out of date. Back then, much of the continent was covered with ice. But as this began to melt, people gradually moved south until about 10,000 years ago. They reached the very tip of South America. And with the passing of the last ice age, North America developed into a land of immense variety and contrast, extending from the Arctic wastes of northern Canada and Alaska to the subtropical regions of Florida and California. It's a land of high mountain ranges and dense forests, fertile river valleys, and wide, grassy plains, swamps, and deserts. The Indians of North America followed different ways of life according to different types of regions they inhabited, developing skills and traditions best suited to the natural environment and the resources which they offered. In the far north, around the Arctic coasts, lived the Eskimos, nomadic hunters, and they depended on both land and sea for their food and livelihood. You got seals, walruses, whales, caribou, which they got food and blubber for and fat for heat and light, and skins for clothing, shelter, and boats. In winter, seals and walruses were hunted through holes cut in the ice, but in summer, when the ice broke up, they were harpooned from light canoes called kayaks. And whales were hunted from larger open boats, or umiaks, which could carry 8 to 10 men. And Eskimo clothing provided extremely good protection against the harsh climate. Sealskin was used for summer clothing. Warmer caribou hide was preferred for winter. Both men and women wore hooded parkas with trousers, boots, and mittens, often 2 layers of each, during a cold winter. And during the summer months, people lived in skin tents, but in winter they built more permanent dwellings of stone, wood, and turf. Where these materials were not available, domed snow houses or igloos were constructed from blocks of hard-packed snow and ice, and several families constructed usually lived together in one large house, or in a cluster of igloos linked by a common entrance tunnel. Often settlements consisted of only 1 or 2 such family groups, except when several groups came together for communal hunting or for religious coastal areas inhabited by the Eskimos were almost completely treeless, but further south stretched great forests of pine, spruce, larch, and cedar. The Indians who lived there were few in number and widely scattered. There were also hunters and fishermen traveling in small groups during the long, dark winter months and coming together in larger camps for the short summer. And like the Eskimos, the Indians of the North forests needed to consume large quantities of food in order to combat the cold, to gain energy for hunting. Caribou, moose, bears, beavers, and hares were trapped or hunted with bows and arrows. Birds were caught in nets and snares, and around the lakes fishing was important, especially at the times of year when other forms of food were scarce. The most common shelter was a conical tent of skin or bark, which was easily constructed and transported, although in the western part of the area more substantial caribou and moose skins were used for making clothing as well as bedding, and bags for carrying goods and belongings, and other short containers and dishes for cooking and serving were made from pieces of birch bark folded into shape, then stitched with spruce roots. Birch bark was also used for making canoes. Large sheets were fastened to a wooden framework, and again with spruce roots, and the seams coated with spruce gum to make them watertight. Birch bark canoes were very light and could easily be carried around the rapids or between one waterway and another. In winter, sleds and toboggans were used for hauling goods, and snowshoes were worn, designed to prevent the wearer from sinking into the snow. Now along the rocky Pacific coast, from southern Alaska to northern California, the climate is much wilder, with a heavy rainfall, producing thick forests and heavy undergrowth. In this area, the Indians had little need of warm clothing. Capes woven from shredded cedar bark and wide-brimmed basketry hats served to protect them from the rain, and most of the year they went barefoot. Wildlife was plentiful. The Indians here caught fish with hooks, nets, and spears, and hunted seals and sea lions, and whales from canoes with harpoons. Inland, wild plants and berries were gathered, and animals such as deer, bears, and mountain goats were trapped or shot with bows and arrows. Because of the wealth of readily available food, the Indians had ample leisure to develop their artistic skills, especially in woodworking. Canoes, cradles, boxes, dishes, spoons, and many other items were made of wood, and almost everything was elaborately carved and painted, whether it was for everyday use or like masks and rattles for ceremonial purposes. Their large, rectangular houses were also built of wood. Several related families, perhaps 30 or 40, lived in each house, and larger villages consisted of 8 or 10 houses. Each house was under the direction of a house chief, with a head chief in charge of the village. Each village was independent and owned its own land, fishing grounds and hunting territory. There was no tribal chief or overall authority, although several villages might come together for ceremonies or warfare. Okay. Let's see. Now on the other side of the country around Great Lakes in the Woodlands, which stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, the Indians, and by the way, this book, of course, like I said, was printed in the early 80s, maybe even written in the late 70s, so when I say Indians, of course, we all mean Native Americans. And we have the North American Indian mythology, is what this book is called. So, in case I say Indians, of course I don't mean to be offensive to anybody, so I hope you'll forgive me if I do read it as it's written here. The Indians also lived in large, well-organized villages, often surrounded by timber stockades. Some built long rectangular houses of wood with rounded or sloping roofs of thatch or bark, and others lived in round dome-shaped huts, which they called wigwams. Villages sometimes formed leagues for the purposes of war or trade. There was no central government within a tribe, although people might be linked by the same language and customs, or through ties of kinship. Every village was ruled independently by an elected chief with a council to advise them and help maintain law and order. The natives in this land, this area, from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River on the East Coast, hunted and fished and gathered wild plants like those in other areas, but they were chiefly farmers, growing many varieties of corn, beans, squash in the fields around their villages. These were the people who introduced the first European explorers and settlers to corn, potatoes, and tobacco. In the east of the Mississippi River Valley, reaching as far as the Rockies, lie the rolling east of the Mississippi Valley. I think they mean west. That's weird. Lie the rolling prairies and grasslands known as the Great Plains. There we go. So we started off here, or here, then we went to the northwest, very lush and green. Then we went over from the Great Lakes in the eastern woodlands, all the way down to north of Florida. And now we're working our way west into the Great Plains. So, the natives here were of many tribes, with different languages and customs, yet having much in common. All were dependent on the buffalo for food and raw materials, and on the horse for transport. Now I thought, okay, here it goes. Now, it does say the horses evolved in the New World, but became extinct there long before the Indians arrived. They were brought back by Spanish settlers in the 16th century, was not until the middle of the 18th century that they became common on the plains. Before then, buffalo and other game were actually pursued on foot. Several hunters would often join together around a herd to round it up and stampede it into a corral or over a cliff. Some tribes, and that's crazy that there were so many buffalo that they could risk killing thousands of them just to eat a few in a stampede over a cliff. Some tribes, particularly those in the eastern plains, were farmers like those in the eastern woodlands, growing corn and other crops. But the coming of horses made hunting much, much easier, and most tribes gave up farming to become nomadic hunters. And those who continued to farm built houses of wood and turf. But most of the plains Indians lived in teepees, conical tents made of poles covered with buffalo skins. Their clothing was also made of skin, with shirts and leggings for men and long belted dresses for women. Clothing for ceremonial occasions was painted and decorated with fur, feathers, and porcupine quills, although the quills were later replaced by glass beads supplied by white traders. Every tribe was composed of several related bands, each numbering 100 or more people. In autumn, the bands separated and took to the river valleys and foothills of the Rockies to seek shelter from the cold winter winds sweeping down from the north. Here they lived in camps under the direction of a chief, aided by the council of elders. So with the warmer weather, they left their winter quarters and moved out into the open plains in search of buffalo. By early summer, the bands of each tribe had reunited to form a large encampment of several thousand people. At the center of the great circle of teepees, a special lodge was erected for the chiefs and their counselors to meet and plan hunting expeditions, war parties, and other meaningful activities. It says warfare was a way of gaining respect and status within the tribe. Killing was not necessarily the object, for it was considered more brave and honorable to steal an enemy's horses, or weapons, or to touch him and escape unscathed than to actually kill him. And warriors vied with each other in performing daring deeds of this kind. Wow, I think that's so really a sophisticated way of acting. Seriously. They learned to cherish life, but also respect each other by outwitting each other. That's really cool and respectable. Southwest of the plains, the landscape changes dramatically. Much of it consists of a high plateau of red and orange sandstone, cut by deep canyons with sheer-sided flat-top hills called mesas and towering rocks worn into fantastic shapes by wind and rain. Forests of pine and fir covered the mountain ranges, and clumps of cedar and juniper grow on the lower slopes and in the valleys, but elsewhere lies a semi-desert area baked hard and dry by the sun, supporting only cacti and small stunted bushes. You can see here, it really turns into pure desert south here, before you get far enough south into the southern Mexico and central, the lush green jungles of Central America. Very weird how it changes like that. Nevertheless, there is enough seasonal rainfall in the southwest to make agriculture possible, and the Pueblo Indians grew corn, vegetables, and fruit. Pueblo is the Spanish word for a town. Was applied to these Indians, these natives, by the 16th century. Spanish explorers of this area who were impressed by their large villages built of stone and sun-dried mud bricks. The villages consisted of several large multi-storied houses arranged around one or more courtyards, and many buildings were terraced so that the roof of each house formed a balcony for the one above. And access to the upper stories was provided by wooden ladders, which could be drawn up in time of danger. So the Pueblo Indians also grew cotton, which they spun and wove into blankets and clothing. The men wore cotton shirts and kilts, and the women dresses and shawls. Each village, or pueblo, was governed by a chief and a council. Sometimes the chief was not elected but appointed for life, but in others he was elected every year. And often a second chief was appointed to supervise the defense of the pueblo and to lead war parties. And neighboring tribes, like the Navajo, also grew crops, but concentrated more on hunting deer and small game. They were nomadic people, and their homes were temporary shelters of brushwood in summer and logs covered with earth in the winter. Yeah, that must have been, must have been really beautiful. It's, at least if you're not in a very hot, humid climate like Florida. Their clothing, the Navajo, was made of skin, although they sometimes traced cotton garments or traded from the Pueblo. During the 17th century, 1600s, Spanish settlers brought sheep and goats in the area, and the Navajo became shepherds, moving around the country in search of water and grazing for their flocks. Later they learned to spin and weave the wool of their flocks and made clothing from it. The nomadic tribes were divided into many small bands, each with its own chief who held office for life, and often succeeded by a son if he proved worthy. West of the Great Plains, between the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada, lies one of the most arid and inhospitable regions of North America. So, the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada. So, I guess, right here. And it really does get ridiculously hot there. You have to turn off your AC so it doesn't overheat as we're driving our lush, luxurious, comfy, elegant, modern So the tribes who lived here they were among the poorest in the country, but their knowledge of the land kept them from starving. The short, scrubby vegetation supplied them with their main diet of seeds, roots, and nuts, as well as with materials for building their flimsy brush shelters. There were few deer to be found in this area, but the Indians made use of wildlife, such as rabbits, lizards, rats, and even birds. Even caterpillars and grasshoppers were not despised as food. The search for food kept the Indians constantly on the move. For a week or so, a small group would camp by a seed patch, stripping it completely, then moving on, traveling mainly on foot. So beyond the Sierra Nevada, in what is now California, the Indians led a similarly simple existence, but here food was more abundant and life much easier. Their staple diet was a mushy porridge made from acorns, pounded and boiled. And the sea provided a variety of fish and shellfish, and the richer vegetation not only made food gatherings less time-consuming, but also provided the women with materials for making baskets, a craft for which they excelled, And finely woven baskets were made for all sorts of purposes, and those as gifts or ceremonies were especially beautiful, often decorated with clamshell beads, or covered entirely with brilliant colored feathers. And just as the lives of North American Indians, Native Americans differed from one area to another, so did their beliefs and myths, for these reflected their experience of the world. The hunting tribes, for example, told many stories of animal spirits, while those who were farmers were more concerned with the beings who they believed controlled rainfall and the growth of crops. All these spirits had to be treated with respect and caution, for although they could be called upon to help in time of need, they could also be dangerous, and there were many complicated rules of conduct to be followed if the spirits were not to be angered and cause storms, sickness, famine, and other calamities to strike mankind. Hunters, for example, often treated animals which they killed with great ceremony, so that their spirits might be placated and return to be hunted again. Those who broke the rules and offended the spirits could perhaps bring hardship, suffering not only to themselves but to the whole community. Many of the Indian myths explain the origin of these rules and how they should be followed. And other stories tell of individuals receiving help of spirits through personal contact with them. Young men wishing to make their way in the world often sought such help by going alone into a remote, desolate place to fast and pray into remote for guidance. After denying themselves food and oil and water for several days, they often had visions in which spirits appeared. They appeared to befriend them and to instruct them in rituals which would bring them wealth and success. A man who was blessed with special help from the spirits could become a medicine man or shaman, So many of the myths and legends were considered sacred and could only be recounted by certain people, but others were intended purely for entertainment and could be told by anyone. The time for telling stories was around campfires on long winter evenings, for then the natives had leisure for such pastimes. Then, too, the Indians said the animals slept and could not be offended by overhearing the many tales which poked fun at them or showed them in a poor light. Since the arrival of the first European settlers in the 1500s, much has changed for the Indians. Little of the traditional way of life remains. Guns have long since ousted bows and arrows, and the motorized forms of transport have largely replaced sleds, canoes, and horses. Large industrial cities now cover the old hunting grounds, and skin clothing is rarely seen except on special occasions. While many natives still farm, hunt, and fish, in the reservations, of course, where they were placed during the 19th century, the 1800s. Much of their equipment is modern and factory-made. Many ceremonies have fallen into disuse, and many myths are indeed forgotten, for they were not written down. And although some recorded in other ways, such as on totem poles or in sand paintings, for example, much of them aren't written down. But a great number are still, in fact, remembered. And around winter firesides, when these animals are asleep, those with long memories continue to instruct their listeners in the customs and values of their forefathers. And then now the book opens up. Some very beautiful pictures. I like this one. You know, the opossum lost its tail fur. Looks good. Looks like an interesting one. Look at that massive bird. That's a beautiful picture too. Wow. So I'm gonna leave it here, and so thanks again